Hello everyone, and welcome back to JAS Reviews. My name is James, and welcome to the debut of another new series on my channel, although this is sort of a variation of my last video. If you all have seen my last video, you will remember that I debuted a new series for doing album reviews called Quick Album Reviews. Not the most creative title out there, but it's to the point, and now I am going to be doing my movie variation of that, because as you know, if you are subscribed to my channel, I do reviews of both music and movies on this channel, along with the occasional commentary piece. Like the music reviews, this series will be breaking down my thoughts on, at most, and this should be what I will do for every movie review video like this, 10 movies in quick succession. So, let's go ahead and not waste any more time and get started with the first movie I will be discussing. So, this series is going to start off with movies that are more recent, and then as we get further and further along, it'll get to movies that were out a longer time ago, so I don't blame you if after a while you get less interested and want to click off on movies that have been out for a longer time. But nevertheless, I think all of the movies I'm going to be discussing here are worth talking about for one reason or another. And the first movie I will be talking about is one that has had, of course, huge success like pretty much every other Marvel movie, and that is Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. Now, when I heard that Sam Raimi was going to be the director for this movie, my excitement for this movie went up significantly more than a lot of Marvel movies have recently. This most recent phase of Marvel has not been the most interesting, I won't lie. My only hope was that the movie wouldn't neuter him of his creative directorial eye and would actually give him the chance to do something interesting and really show his directorial skills, because I love the Raimi Spider-Man films, all three of them, even the third one for as flaws as it is. The first two Spider-Man movies of that series are some of my favorite superhero movies out there, and of course I love when he does horror too. His Evil Dead series is excellent, so this movie seemed to be combining the best of both worlds for him. Well, I will say that for both better and for worse, this is a Sam Raimi film through and through. Although I would say it is undeniably a much more messy Sam Raimi movie. And in some ways, I'm not sure if that messiness is entirely his fault, because the writing in this movie is a disaster. It is interesting, but it's also a disaster. There were some really cool aspects to this movie, and I think there were some pretty cool and creative visual decisions that they made. But at the same time, I feel like they didn't really do as much interesting with the multiverse as they could have. And this movie was especially coming off the heels of another far better multiverse movie as well that I will be talking about later on. So having that one to compare it to was a little rough for this movie, admittedly. But at the same time, what they do with the multiverse here isn't bad. It just doesn't have the same level of quality that I feel like a multiverse movie like Spider-Man No Way Home did. But nevertheless, I did enjoy the creativity the movie had, even if it wasn't going as far as I felt it could. And also, I thought that their performances across the board were pretty great in this movie. One of the stronger performed Marvel movies from all our main actors, I felt like. I think Benedict Cumberbatch was really good in this. I'm not sure if I necessarily loved him as Doctor Strange in the first Doctor Strange movie, but I really liked what he did here, and I think he was having a lot of fun with his performance. I also think Elizabeth Olsen was really good as Wanda in this movie. I really think it was a cool decision on this movie's part to make her a full-fledged villain. In fact, it really made sense to me because of how Wanda has been built up. It was always sort of weird to me how they wanted us to forgive Wanda for what she did in WandaVision. It seems like they were wanting us to really understand her actions there when they weren't really that sympathetic at the end of the day. And I like that this movie sort of grapples with that more and shows that her actions in that show were not that sympathetic, and that her motivations ultimately lead her to do some pretty evil stuff. But let's go on and talk about Sam Raimi's directing, because yeah, this is a Sam Raimi movie through and through, and for the most part, I had a great time with that. There were some moments here that reminded me so much of the original Spider-Man movies, and it sent waves of nostalgia through me. There were some scenes that felt like they were sort of inspired by the original Spider-Man movies that I really liked. And there's even some really creative moments where he pays homage to Evil Dead, and it's one of those things where you can't help but smile and just have a fun time because it's clear that Sam Raimi is enjoying himself as well. that makes this movie one of the most unique Marvel movies I've seen in recent history, honestly. It feels like they actually let the director have some control over the movie, so it feels very distinct from other Marvel movies in that regard. But at the same time, there are some noticeable flaws. Like I said, this movie script is all over the place, and that's really what weighs this movie down. It goes from one thing to the next, with not much rhyme or reason, in my opinion, and it's just the characters going from one thing to another in sort of crazy fashion, and it makes the movie a little discombobulated. Also, even though I really liked America's character, I think her prime motivation was, and her backstory was a little silly. I think they were trying to make it seem like it had some weight and seriousness to it, but the reason she has this trauma about her superpowers is ultimately a little too silly and a little unbelievable almost. Nevertheless, even when I combine all my problems with this movie, and that includes the cameos that this has, because yes, now Marvel movies just can't go without cameos, and the cameos in here are probably the most unnecessary yet of any Marvel movie. Even with all that considered, I did enjoy this movie overall in the midst of its very obvious flaws. I think this is one of the most obviously flawed Marvel movies out there, especially in its writing. But even with that, this is Sam Raimi doing what Sam Raimi does. And the fact that the performers are having such a good time, especially Benedict Cumberbatch and Elizabeth Olsen, makes this a movie that is well worth watching, in my opinion. 3.5 out of 5 stars. It's not one of Marvel's top tier, but it is one of Marvel movies that I had the most fun with. Next, let's talk about a movie I just saw, and oh man, is this one going to be complicated to talk about. I'm glad I'm including this one in this format because I just don't really know what to say about it right now, and that is Men, which was directed by Alex Garland. This is his third film following 2 films that I really enjoy, Annihilation and especially Ex Machina, which I think is pretty much a masterwork by him. I really love what that movie does. This movie is a huge deviation from his previous 2, as well as his show Devs, as it pretty much entirely ditches the sci-fi and goes for a much more surreal horror feel almost the whole way through. We see our main character Harper dealing with some trauma from her husband, who it was discovered had died, whether by suicide or by accident, we don't know, but she feels some lingering guilt for her ex-husband's death, and that guilt is haunting her, so she goes to live in the English countryside to try and forget about it and maybe try to find some peace there. But while she is on this seemingly peaceful and beautiful English countryside, she discovers a mysterious tunnel and then discovers that there's this odd person stalking her, and it brings back this trauma of her husband's death to the forefront, as well as some other lingering trauma that we continue to learn about as this movie develops. This is an interesting movie to discuss, I will say that much. I am going to say that I was never once bored in this movie. I think it stays pretty engaging throughout. I think it stays consistently interesting and has some pretty intriguing stuff that it is trying to say. I really like that this movie has a slow burn feel to it, a slow burn build-up, and I think it does a good job at the beginning parts of really building that tension steadily. There are some parts that are actually pretty tense and work pretty well, especially that tunnel scene, which really does a good job at establishing that this world isn't exactly what our main character thinks it is. And it creates that uneasy feeling that stays with you for a good portion of the movie, in my opinion. Also, I think overall the performances in this film are excellent. Jessie Buckley is quickly becoming clear as one of the best actresses working right now. She really proves herself to be excellent in this movie, despite having a character that I think is sadly a little thin when you think about her too much. Rory Kinnear is excellent in this movie. He plays pretty much every man in the movie besides the husband. There's even a child in here with his face sort of digitized on it, which creates a very uncanny valley feeling that I think is quite effective. And the fact that he's playing every man, I think, brings about some pretty obvious commentary from Garland that in the view of our main character and perhaps other women that all men are the same to them, that they have been traumatized by toxic masculinity and toxic men like these people, and because of that, there's not much difference from one man to the next. And while that commentary is pretty on the nose, I feel like, it's not really ever commented upon directly, so it's not as bad as it could be, or as on the nose as it could be. But there's also some huge problems with this movie, some very glaring ones. For one, a problem that I was already sort of building up to is that this movie is very on the nose on parts. In some places, it's practically spoon-feeding you with what the message is supposed to be. And yet, in other parts, it wants to sort of hold you at arm's length and let you interpret for yourself. It wants to have it both ways. And because of that, the second half of this movie becomes a disjointed mess, in my opinion. It suddenly changes into a whole other beast entirely. I think it jumps the shark, honestly, at the end, and becomes very stupid. There is a scene that happens that just... When this scene happened, I realized that I was watching one of A24's weirder movies, and one of their not good weirder movies on that note as well. With all that being said, this movie is divided into two halves for me. There's the really good first half, the good building up of tension, and the great performances, as well as striking cinematography and a really good soundtrack. But then there's a second half where the tension starts to dissipate, and they start repeating things and repeating points over and over again, and then that utterly bizarre third act where it just goes off the rails and really loses me. So because of that, because of my feelings on this movie being divided into two halves, I have to give this movie a 2.5 out of 5 stars. It started out with such potential, but I think it really fell off in the end, unfortunately. Next, I want to talk about Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers. Weird that I'm talking about this movie. I didn't really expect to, but I saw that it was getting a lot of good reception, and people were talking about it as a surprisingly clever and funny movie. And yeah, it's actually a pretty decent watch. It's not anything that's going to blow your mind, and it's not anything that's going to be like, wow, this is a masterpiece in animation or anything like that, but I think it works for what it's trying to do. I think the central story in here is actually pretty good. I think it, despite all the IP crossover stuff this has, it is actually one of the more tolerable ones. It's like if Ready Player One actually had a coherent plot at the center of it, in my opinion. Weird to compare this movie to that one, but when you watch it, you'll see why I'm making that comparison. And I think it's because it is focusing still on our central duo, Chip and Dale, even though there are other IPs in here and other characters that appear and lots of cameos. Chip and Dale are still at the center of this movie overall, and I think that's very helpful for this movie's quality. I think they're both fun characters to follow along with, especially as they're voiced very well by Andy Samberg and John Mulaney, two great comedians. I will say, as far as weaknesses go, animation-wise, this movie isn't as well animated as it could be, in my opinion, and I think the crossover of cartoon and CGI and stop motion and other types of animation isn't as strong as it could be, and I think they're animated in ways that makes them not necessarily mesh well with the real-world environment as they could be. It was a pretty predictable movie. Now, the movie does sort of call itself out and call itself predictable in some places, but that still doesn't mean that the movie is exempt from being called predictable, because it sort of is. But nevertheless, I mean, this is a fun kids movie. It's not something that I was really expecting anything incredible from, so the fact that I got some clever commentary and some witty comebacks at Disney is more than I was expecting from this movie, and I did have a fun time with it nevertheless. 3 out of 5 stars for this one. Next, let's talk about the second Downton Abbey movie, A New Era. Now, Downton Abbey is a show that I never expected to have quite the affection for that I do now. When I first heard about it and read about it, it just sounded like a melodrama to me with snobbish upper-class British people. But when I tuned into the show, I was surprised to find a show that had a very compelling cast of characters and some really good commentary on how upper-class and lower-class relations were and how those disparities created Britain in the 1920s. I've even watched the show upwards of 3 times, which there's only a couple other shows which I've done that with. And I really liked the first Downton Abbey movie that ended up coming out about 3 years ago at this point, I think it was. It was a very fun movie, a very fun continuation of the show, and while it is more like one of the mediocre episodes of season 5 or 6, I still had a great time seeing the cast again, and I think it followed a pretty fun premise, and I'd honestly thought it wrapped up every character's stories pretty well, so I was surprised, but still excited, when they announced a sequel. And actually, my feelings on the sequel are about the same as the first movie. I will say that I liked the sequel ever so slightly more than the first film. Not significantly more, but ever so slightly more. I think what helps this movie more than anything else is that it has a lot more intriguing subplots going on, whereas the first was really hyper-focused on this one plot. This one has 3 or 4 different things going on at the same time, and that makes it honestly feel more in line with the TV show than the first movie did. I liked the idea that they had a movie within a movie, and it was fun to see all the characters' various reactions to a movie being put on at Downton, and each character had a reaction that I felt like was very in line with their character, like the way that Carson was reacting to a movie being put on versus a character like Daisy or Mosley made a lot of sense to me and was a lot of fun and brought some great laughs. So that was a fun aspect of this movie. And I think it also really helps that each character, especially the main ones, actually has a little bit of better material to sink their teeth into this time around as well, as opposed to in the first movie. I will say that I thought in the first movie that Michelle Dockery's performance as Lady Mary was a little underwhelming and a little weak, but in this one, her performance is far more in line with what we got from her in Downton Abbey, and I think that's because she has some material that she is used to working with this character, and while it is very familiar territory, it's definitely something we've seen Mary deal with before. I think she handles this arc once again as well as she had in the show. The same goes for Laura Carmichael as Lady Edith. Now, I really did like her performance in the first movie, but I thought the first movie sort of stripped her of what made her interesting, which was her doing some journalistic adventures and doing investigations, and this movie brings that back, and I like that they do that. They give her something to do beyond just, oh, I'm pregnant and going to have a baby. There's even some performances in here that really surprised me, especially from Hugh Bonneville as Lord Grantham. Lord Grantham is not a character I've ever particularly liked in the show. I find him to be a bit insufferable, and I think that's partly the point, is that he's supposed to be very resistant to change, and he's supposed to be a very flawed main character, but I think he actually is a lot more sympathetic here. I think that's mainly because of how he reacts to certain things in the movie, and I think he has a pretty weighty thing to deal with here that is surprisingly big for his character, and I think the way he reacts to that and deals with that is pretty compelling. And I think he has some surprisingly emotional moments here that I was not expecting from his character. Of course, Maggie Smith as Lady Grantham, as the Dowager, she is wonderful as always, and she gives a performance here to be remembered. Just wow, one of the best performances of the year so far. Now, this movie isn't perfect by any means. Like I said, it's sort of similar to the first one in that it feels like a less consequential episodes of season 5 or 6. I personally prefer the episodes of Downton from seasons 1 through 3, where the characters were having more weighty stuff to deal with. But at the same time, I understand that fans aren't necessarily looking for their favorite characters to suffer again, so that's not a huge deal for me, but at the same time, it makes the movie a little boring at points, especially in the beginning. I think it lags a lot. And it has also been particularly disappointing to me that in these movies, Mr. and Mrs. Bates have really been reduced to very, very small roles. Like, even characters like Mosley and Daisy, who are smaller than them in the show, have more to do in this movie than they do. It seems like the movie doesn't know what to do with them at this point, which is unfortunate because they were such a huge and vital identity to the TV show. I had a smile on my face the whole time while watching it. It was lovely seeing all these amazing actors reunited again and still playing their characters like they were playing them yesterday. All of them, for the most part, did a great job. It was great seeing Thomas back. It was great seeing him go through his wonderful character arc. Although it was a repeat of the first time, I think the way he went through his character arc this time was better. And seeing Tom Branson get married and be happy is something that I was just overjoyed about, as he is my favorite character in the show, and Alan Leach is just awesome as his character. And there's so many great fan service moments in here too, like a moment with Mary and Carson that just really worked well. I mean, it was lifted pretty much directly from the show, but I think it was good fan service nevertheless. So I think this show has a lot that fans are going to like, even in the midst of its very clear flaws. And for that reason, I'm going to give this one a strong 3.5 out of 5 stars. Next, let's talk about Turning Red, the latest Pixar movie that is yet another one where they only released it to streaming and not to theaters. Now, Turning Red had surprisingly a lot of controversy around it. I think it might be the most controversial Pixar movie released thus far. A lot of people seem to be upset that it was talking about puberty in such a frank way and addressing things that some parents said kids were too young to really talk about, and some seem to be criticizing that the movie seemed to be supporting kid rebellion and teenagers rebelling against their parents. But when I watched the movie, I honestly didn't see that at all, and I think these complaints were very insincere, in my opinion, and very silly for the most part. Now, does this mean I think that Turning Red is a masterwork of Pixar's? No, I don't think that this is one of Pixar's better movies. In fact, I'd compare it pretty much to Luca that came out in the past year. It feels pretty much in line with the quality of that movie. For one, I think the premise is pretty fun, that this character is going through puberty and going through changes, and whenever they get really stressed or really angry, they turn into this panda that is part of a historical curse that has been passed down from their family for generations. But this main character eventually decides, her name is Mei, by the way, she eventually decides that she does not want to get rid of the panda. She wants to rebel against her mother's wishes in that regard and keep with it. And I think that makes for an interesting tension between parent and daughter. And I think that that tension works well. I think it's interesting to see this character who wants to actually please her parents and has felt that pressure to do so for years, but eventually is realizing that she doesn't want to do literally everything in her power to please them, and that she wants to also do things that she cares about. I also really like the animation style of this movie. There's some clear points where it's inspired by anime-styled animation, especially in the way they animate eyes in certain scenes, and I think that's a lot of fun. And I also just like that they sort of embrace preteen cringe as well, because as preteens, everyone was a little cringe during this time. Everyone did things that they were a little embarrassed by, and I like that the movie embraces that. I mean, there are some flaws to this movie. I think it's actually not that funny at the end of the day. I think some of the jokes it tries to tell aren't that great, and the premise of using an animal for puberty, while fun, isn't necessarily done as creatively as I think it could have been. And I mean, at the end of the day, there are still some parts of this movie that feel a little bit cliched, and I'm not sure that I really love every single character in this movie. I like Mei and I like the mother, but a lot of the other characters in this, especially Mei's friends, just aren't as interesting to me as I think they could be. But still, this was a good Pixar movie, and I still think that Pixar is one of the best animated companies out there. Some seem to think they've fallen off, and I personally just can't agree with that. I still think they produce really good material, and while this isn't up with the quality of some of their best, like Coco or Inside Out or Toy Story, it still is a good movie, and one that I enjoyed. 3.5 out of 5 stars for me. Next, let's talk about The Innocents, which is a movie that I've really been anticipating and looking forward to ever since I saw, interestingly enough, the movie poster. I didn't even watch a trailer for this, but the movie and poster was so interesting to me that it made me want to check the movie out immediately. And wow, this movie was excellent. It's going to probably be one of my favorites of the year. I really liked its premise. I don't even want to reveal much about it, so I'm not going to say much about this movie, actually. But I think that this movie did very well with its central idea. All the kid actors here are great. Some of the best kid performances I've ever seen. Raquel Flautum, I don't even know if I'm saying that right because they're from a different country, plays Ida, our main character, and I think she does really well. She plays a character who is very flawed, and some of the things she does in here are very unlikable, and purposefully so, but I think the character arc and growth that she goes through is very compelling, and I appreciate that the director is delving so deeply into a child's psyche. It works very well. Also, Sam Ashraf as Ben, wow, what a performance. If this is the performance he is putting on at this age, I just can't imagine what he's going on to do in the future. This is a horror movie through and through, and I think it really builds that tension well up until the end where you can just palpably feel the tension in this sort of showdown that happens. It works so well. And I think there's a very touching message at the heart of this movie as well, about compassion and empathy and just finding that for people and how you need to sort of discover that as a kid, which is something that is very interestingly highlighted in this movie. Overall, this was just an excellent movie with not a whole lot of problems, except that maybe there were some parts where it went a little too cruel in its premise, and there were some scenes that were maybe a little too upsetting that happened. But nevertheless, I liked the risks this movie took. They worked more often than not, and the child performances make this movie worth the price of admission alone. Strong 4 out of 5 stars for this one. Everyone's talked about this movie at this point, all the big critics, so I'm just going to keep my thoughts brief, but Everything Everywhere All at Once is a masterwork of a film. I mean, wow. This is the multiverse film that I saw before Doctor Strange 2, and yeah, it made Doctor Strange 2 pale a lot in comparison because this movie is just so creative in what it does. It really embraces the potentials of the multiverse in every conceivable way possible. The title of this movie is so appropriate because it feels like Everything Everywhere All at Once. There's so many film genres happening, there's so many types of films, there's so many different plot lines, and it all just works so cohesively. This movie feels like it would be on the brink of constantly falling under the weight of its own premise, but somehow it doesn't, and that is just an impressive thing to do, and I think that shows the director's talents. All the performances are excellent from every actor in this movie. There's just not many problems I have with it, except that maybe in the end they try to cram in some other plot lines that will maybe not necessarily needed, but nevertheless, I mean, just an excellent movie. My favorite movie of the year. It's going to be hard to beat this one out. 4.5 out of 5 stars for me. Okay, for these last couple, I'm going to try to go through them pretty quickly. And I also don't have a lot to say about all these movies, but let's go ahead and talk about Ambulance, Michael Bay's latest. I think this was a pretty solid action movie. Michael Bay is not a director I generally enjoy much, but I did actually enjoy this movie quite a bit. I think that was mainly due to the really good performances in here, especially from Jake Gyllenhaal. Jake Gyllenhaal is going full Jake Gyllenhaal here, and that is a good thing. And I think Yahya Abdul-Mateen worked really well as a straight man counterpart to Jake Gyllenhaal, although he has some funny lines as well. And Eiza Gonzalez was actually a pretty big highlight in here too, as the EMT Cam Thompson, who was sort of trying to save a police officer's life while the two main characters were driving along in this dangerous ambulance car chase after they had robbed a bank. So it was a very interesting sort of conglomeration of a lot of different plots happening at the same time on this ambulance. The complicated relationship between these two main characters who are brothers, as well as the fact that they had robbed a bank. All the while, this EMT is trying to save this cop's life who one of them had shot. It all adds up together to create a very fascinating sequence of events, and the movie just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and I think it works as over the top as it gets. Now, some of the dialogue I think is very on the nose and very unnatural sometimes. Some of the things some characters are saying doesn't feel like it would come from a real human being, but nevertheless, it was a very enjoyable movie, and I was consistently engaged throughout. Solid 3.5 out of 5 stars. Next, let's talk about Choose or Die, which was another in a long series of bad Netflix horror movies, and bad Netflix movies in general. For every great movie, even masterful movie that Netflix releases, they seem to release at least a couple more that are just not good quality at all, and this is one of those. This is one of the weakest horror movies I've seen in recent memory. Its central premise, I guess, is pretty cool, actually, that there's this sort of sentient video game that lets you sort of choose an option, and if you don't choose anything, then you will die. The logistics of the video game ultimately don't make a whole lot of sense. It seems like they're throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks, different types of video games, different types of video game concepts. And because of that, the logistics of the game just don't ever add up. And it becomes something that just doesn't make sense when you really break it down at the end of the day. Also, I think the performances in this weren't superb. They were very mediocre. Not terrible necessarily, but I also feel like these actors were stuck with a bad script. I mean, Asa Butterfield is a very talented actor, but he is stuck into this geeky nerd stereotype that just doesn't really give him much leverage to do anything with. Iola Evans, as our main character Kayla, has a little bit more interesting stuff to work with, but her character also feels incredibly messy, and her motivations sort of go all over the place. At the end of the day, this is just a bad horror movie through and through. There are some fun moments, some creative moments in here that almost make up for how stupid it is, but still, at the end of the day, this movie was pretty dumb, and I just didn't care for it. Probably one of the worst movies I've seen this year. 2 out of 5 stars for me. And finally, let's talk about The Northman, directed by Robert Eggers. This is his third movie following 2 really great movies in The Witch and The Lighthouse. And this one is once again an entirely different beast from the other 2. I love how he's consistently changing up what he does. This one is pretty much a Shakespearean epic told in Norse myth form. It's the story of Hamlet told with Vikings, and it is so much fun because of that, and very brutal. Alexander Skarsgård puts on a career best as Amleth. I think this is his best performance to date, and that's saying a lot considering he has a lot of great performances under his belt, but he is superb here, and I really think he brings a lot of authority and menace to his performance. It's so much fun following him and his character arc. Anya Taylor-Joy is excellent as Olga. She also puts on one of her best performances to date, and I think the chemistry she has with Alexander Skarsgård feels very tangible and real. I really like what she does in the movie and the sort of changes that she goes through, which aren't necessarily what you'd predict considering where her character starts, but I think where her character ends up is pretty interesting and works well. I think Ethan Hawke was great in this, even though he was in it for a criminally short amount of time. And Claes Bang was really good as well, as sort of the antagonist Fjolnir, although calling him an antagonist isn't necessarily accurate in the way the movie presents it, interestingly enough. He has some sympathetic aspects to him that are a little surprising, especially considering how our main character wants to take revenge on him. So, with all that being said, this is an excellent movie. Well shot, beautiful cinematography, some scenes where it really goes there for the brutality, especially in the end, it really goes there, and I love it for that reason. This is a superb movie, one of my favorites of the year. 4.5 out of 5 stars. So yeah, sorry for that video going on a little bit longer than I expected, but some of you all probably clicked off after you saw the newer movies that I was talking about, which I don't blame you for. But if you have stayed this long, thank you so much. And once again, my name is James. I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece. And be expecting probably an individual movie review, as well as probably an individual album review coming very soon. But until then, I'll see you all in the next video.